5.
Should have done 4 or 5 very
And 37. Well, good evening, everybody. I was hoping to get over the this is what is coming tonight. And I wanted to say it's great to see you guys that are all out here. Anyway, I guess I did invite all of the local politicians and the people from the Forest Service, and I guess it's their house. And thanks for coming out this evening and for exercising our freedom of assembly. We're going to be informed about wildfires by Dr. Hanson tonight. Dr. Hanson is a research ecologist and the director of the John Muir Project at the Earth Island Institute. He has a PhD in ecology with a research focus on fire ecology and conifer forest ecosystems. He's published dozens of peer-reviewed studies on forest and fire ecology, and is also the co-editor and the co-author of the 2015 book, The Ecological Importance of Mixed-Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix. Some of you have copies of it. One of the reasons I chose to live in this area was because of the trees and forests that surround us. Trees emerged from on Earth 385 million years ago and rapidly removed CO2 from the atmosphere while greatly increasing oxygen to present day proportions, and cooling temperatures on land to temperate levels. So, of course, the large increase in oxygen allowed fires to burn more vigorously. Some trees and fire have been conjoined for a very long time. We know fire is a very real potential hazard for us living here. And Dr. Hanson is going to share some of what he has learned about this relationship between trees and fires and how it might affect us. We'll have some time for questions, I'm sure, and then Seth Blizzard will give a short presentation about home hardening against wildfire threats. Now, Seth was highly instrumental in arranging for Dr. Hanson to be here and speak tonight. And this event wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for him. Thanks, Seth. And so, without further ado, here's Dr. Hanson.
Thanks. Well, I'm going to talk tonight about some of the misconceptions about wildfire that are creating problems for community safety, creating problems for biodiversity conservation, and problems from a climate change perspective. And as some of you know, I talk about this in a lot more detail in my book, Smokescreen. And some of you may have it, so if you want a deeper dive, you can get a lot more information in my book. All right, so I'm going to do this in 2 parts tonight, and then of course I'll be happy to answer questions after. First part is the current strategy that we are approaching as a society, Congress, land management agencies, of managing the forests, removing trees from the forests, to try to stop fires from reaching towns. Is that working? Is that a successful strategy? And in the second part, I'll talk more about the ecology of the biodiversity ecology of these forest ecosystems after fire. So, one of the key misconceptions is this notion that if a forest is really dense, that it has more fuel and will burn more intensely. Now, obviously, a denser forest has more biomass, but it doesn't necessarily translate that that means it's more combustible. And what's interesting about this is this issue has been studied to death, and there's a really large body of science on this. But what the science is finding is so different from the public dialogue that's happening. It's almost like they exist in 2 different alternative universes. What the science is finding is that the denser the forest is, the less likely it is to burn intensely. Now, a dense forest can burn intensely, just like an open forest if you have hot, dry, windy conditions. But all things being equal, they tend to burn at lower intensities, not higher. And this figure shows that. This is just one of the many studies on this, and that black line is the basically the fire intensity, and then the biomass is on the x-axis there. So what you see is, as biomass goes up, in other words, as you have more forest density, that the fire intensity overall goes down, not up. Similar conclusions in a number of other studies. This is just a small subset of them. Lesmeister et al. 2019, 2021, Meeks et al. 2020, and many, many others. And I talk about a lot of these other studies in my book, Smokescreen. Another big notion out there, and we hear this all the time, is that because we've suppressed fires, that a lot of these forests are overgrown, they haven't burned in, many decades, and therefore, when they burn, they're going to burn much more intensely. And it makes intuitive sense, right? It seems like that would be right. What we find, though, is that the great majority of the research finds that forests that haven't burned in the longest period of time fewer environmental protections and more trees removed, those forests tended to burn more intensely. So the more trees you remove, the hotter and faster fires tend to burn. Now, of course, at local scales, you can get all kinds of variability, but at broader scales, that's the pattern that emerges. And, we start looking at this, and others have been looking at this, different groups of scientists coming at it from different methodologies. And this is a group of scientists that looked at different scenarios, and they found that more often than not, thinning actually increases fire intensity. Sometimes thinned areas will burn at low intensity. Sometimes they'll burn at high intensity. But more often than not, they're going to tend to burn even hotter. And this is very different from what we've been told, because oftentimes when these fires burn, it's those thinned areas that happen to burn at low intensity that get all the attention. So reporters get brought to those same areas again and again, but they're not necessarily representative of what's going on in the fire as a whole. This is a quote from a study recently, and this is a group of scientists that very actively promote thinning for various reasons, but they had to admit in their findings that thinning increased the rate of fire spread. Now, why does that matter? It matters because if fire moves faster through thin forests, that means fires get bigger faster and they reach a town faster. That means people have less time to evacuate. And I'll talk about some real life examples of that in a minute. And this is a quote from a bunch of Forest Service scientists. And this is kind of getting to the heart of the matter of why this seemingly counterintuitive thing is actually true. I'm just going to read it because I think it's so key. More open forests with lower biomass have higher fire severity because the type of open, lower biomass forests resulting from thinning and other logging activities have hotter, drier, and windier microclimates. And those conditions decrease dramatically over relatively short distances into the interior of older forests with multi-layered canopies and high tree density. So here's how it works. A denser forest with more biomass, more trees, more carbon, that forest is going to have higher canopy cover. That higher canopy cover means more cooling shade, less sunlight reaching the forest floor. Everything on the forest floor stays more moist, even in the middle of fire season, relative to a forest with less canopy cover. The most combustible materials on the forest floor, the grasses, shrubs, small twigs, pine needles, the stuff that burns most readily, that stays more moist. And in fact, the grasses and the shrubs tend to die back because they're not getting enough sunlight. This is vegetation that needs very high levels of sunlight in order to thrive. And when it doesn't get that, it tends to die back. Denser forests also act as a windbreak. And as you all know, wind is a key factor in forest fires, the winds that drive the flames. And a denser forest cuts down on the wind speeds because it acts as a windbreak. And so when you remove a bunch of trees from the forest, the winds will sweep through the forest faster, which means they'll sweep the flames through faster. And so it seems counterintuitive at first, but once you understand it, it starts to make sense. And this isn't just theory. We have studied this fire after fire after fire in real-world examples, big fires, And this is a paper I published in 2021 on the creek fire. This is a 380,000 acre fire that burned in 2020 in the southern Sierra Nevada. And I looked at whether or not areas that had been logged in earlier years for the specific purpose of fuel reduction and fire management, commercial thinning operations, post-fire logging, removing dead trees, thinking that that's reducing fuel. I wanted to know how they burned. Now what I found was that the areas that had been, had undergone earlier logging operations under the rubric of fuel reduction, those areas tended to burn more intensely when the creek fire occurred. And I think it comes down to these factors, these microclimate factors. And in fact, interestingly, the areas that burned in earlier wildfires had no post-fire logging and then reburned again in the creek fire. So in other words, wildfire and then more wildfire. That actually had the lowest levels of fire severity. And these are just some of the pictures, you know, just again, there's lots of variability because it's weather and climate, right? So if you've got those really hot, dry, windy conditions, you're going to get high intensity fire effects in any forest. But on average, the very densest forests tended to burn at low intensity in the creek fire. So if it was really about forest density and fuels, you would expect a forest like this would almost always burn at high intensity. But what we saw in the creek fires is that forests like this, on average, tended to burn at lower intensities. And this actually burned. You can hardly see it burn. You can tell, you can see a little bit of scorch on these saplings here. That's about all it did. It just crept along the forest floor, even though this is an incredibly dense forest that had not burned in many decades. Same thing here. Incredibly dense forest, had not burned in many decades, low intensity surface fire, killed some seedlings, killed some saplings, and that's about it. And in stark contrast, areas where most of the trees, many of the trees had been removed, including some of the mature trees that make the forest canopy, those areas burned on average more intensely. And this is one of those areas here. This area has been commercially thinned. You can see the stumps there. And the idea was if you create an open forest and greater spacing between trees, you just won't have a very high intense fire. You'll have lower potential for crown fire. But that's not what we saw at all. And that's not what we're seeing in other fires. I mean, look how open this stand is here. There's very, very little tree cover, very wide spacing between trees. And this was commercially thinned, and that's about as high intensity as you can get at a forest fire. This area here was Southern California Edison lands, and I took this from a ridge looking down. And this area had been heavily managed for 40 years under the fuel reduction kind of management approach. Thinning, prescribed fire, more thinning, more prescribed fire. And the idea was that it'll create very open conditions and prevent high intensity fire. And it's actually one of the most intensely burned areas in the entire fire area. And you can see here that area in the middle looks very kind of sparse because they had already started post-fire logging it just weeks after the flames had passed because it killed almost all the trees in the largest central part of the land management. This area similarly had been post-fire logged in earlier years on Forest Service land, and it burned almost exclusively at high intensity when the creek fire burned. So in other words, removing dead trees was not an effective fuel reduction strategy. Those areas burned even more intensely. So one of the things I was interested in is, okay, it's not just a matter of how fire affects the live trees in thin forests versus unthin forests. You also have to take into account the trees killed by thinning itself. Because if you're not doing that, you're biasing your results, right? Because thinning removes trees, thinning kills trees. That's a source of mortality. And so if the idea is, well, we're going to kill some trees to save more, then the question is that what we're seeing? If you're removing 20% of the trees, but you're saving more than if the fire occurred, okay, then you can make that argument maybe. But we looked at this, and what we found is that when you actually look at what I call cumulative severity, which is including the mortality of trees from thinning plus the mortality from fire, and comparing that to the overall tree mortality in fire alone, with no thinning, the overall mortality is much higher in the thinned areas because of that combination, because they really don't burn at lower intensities than the unthinned forest, sometimes a little bit less intensely, sometimes a little more intensely, but the main difference is a lot of the trees were killed before the fire ever got there. And so it's basically thinning is killing more trees than it's preventing from being killed. And we looked at another fire. This first one, this was the Antelope Fire, which I know you all know well, not too far away. And we said, okay, this is interesting. Let's see if these results are reproducible. Another fire, we looked at the Cowboy Fire that burned in 2021, and this was Baker and Hanson 2022. We found the same thing. The thinned areas have higher cumulative severity, killing more trees than it's preventing from being killed. So I want to circle back again now to the community issue, because why does this matter from a community safety standpoint? It matters a lot. Because right now, our current management approach and the funding coming from Congress, coming from the agencies, is to focus overwhelmingly on thinning and other tree removal projects in the wildlands, out there on the ridge, distant from the towns, half a mile away, a mile and a half away, 5 miles away, based on the idea that that's going to slow a fire, either stop the fire or slow it and make it drop down to a low-intensity, creeping surface fire that will be easily put out by fire suppression crews. Okay, that's the narrative out there. And we have towns all across the West that are relying on that narrative for their safety. And we have literally billions of dollars of taxpayer money that's being spent to support that narrative. And so for me, it matters a lot to find out whether that narrative is holding up in terms of the evidence. And this is just a quote from a Forest Service commercial thinning project called the Trestle Project. And this was a project on the south of the town called Grizzly Flats. It's surrounded by the El Dorado National Forest. And what the Forest Service said was that these thinning units, these fuel treatments, they would have the effect of slowing or stopping a wildfire under 90th percentile conditions. And then 90th percentile is high fire weather, hot, dry, windy conditions. And they even had a graphic showing this, and it's a little difficult to understand, so I apologize for that. But if you see this little kind of curved yellow lines, that's the kind of course of the fire, like if it comes from the south toward the town. And these areas here are the thinning units. And what it shows it doing is just stopping when it hits the thinning units. Gets to the thinning units and just stops. And so this was the message that the people in the town of Grizzly Flats were hearing from a land management agency that they trusted. And so people didn't do their defensible space pruning within 100 feet around their homes. That work didn't get done. Home hardening work didn't get done because people were given a false sense of security, thinking that that logging project, a mile, 2 miles away, south of town, on the ridge, that's going to stop the fire. And this is what happened. Those black areas here, these are the thinning units. This was the early part of the fire, moved this way. And that's where it spread the fastest, was through that area. Now, to be clear, this was driven by hot, dry, windy conditions in a drought year. And the red areas are high-intensity fire patches. The unthinned forest burned mostly at high intensity too, but so did the thinning units. And it didn't stop the fire. That area was going to burn at high intensity at that moment because that's what the weather dictated. And 2/3 of the town of Grizzly Flats is gone now. It didn't have to happen. This is preventable if we redirect our resources, instead of on backcountry logging projects, telling communities it's going to save them from fire. Instead, devote those resources into a jobs program or direct grants to communities to create defensible space around homes, to help people do the home hardening work, especially homeowners that may not have the financial resources to do the work themselves. People need the help oftentimes. They need the technical assistance. Provide that assistance. Use that money. Instead of spending billions on these backcountry projects, spend it protecting homes and lives in the place where we know it actually makes a difference. So, the Caldor Fire is kind of like the tale of two cities. We have on the western side the tragedy of Grizzly Flats, largely working class town. Folks didn't have the resources necessarily to do the work. They could use a little help. They didn't get it. On the eastern side of the Caldor Fire is the community of South Lake Tahoe and Myers. Wealthy communities, people have the resources, they did their home hardening, they did their defensible space pruning, and on top of that, the Forest Service actually allocated their own money to do additional defensible space pruning on the National Forest boundary right next to the private lands. And guess what? It worked. It worked perfectly. I'm not aware of a single home that burned there. The fire reached that narrow zone where the defensible space work had been done. The embers hopped the highway, because that's what they do. They're driven by winds. It doesn't matter how big your so-called fuel break is, the embers are going to hop right over it. And then it just kept going. Reached another area where defensible space had been done. Stopped. Homes were protected. Kept going. This is a success story. This is what works. But this is what very, very few of the resources are supporting right now. Maybe 3% or less of the funds are going to this. Most of it's going to backcountry logging. Again, the big issue there is that people are being told it's going to save them from fire, and that's not happening. And this is the most difficult example. This is the Camp Fire of 2018. This area between the point of origin on the right there, in the area of Tolga, and the town of Paradise, that several thousand acres is some of the most heavily logged in the entire northern Sierra Nevada. On both public lands and private lands, thousands of acres have been thinned, they have been post-fire logged, dead trees removed, live trees removed, and the towns have been told this will save them from fire. It will act as a fuel break because they're creating open conditions, they're reducing fuel. In fact, that's what the Camp Fire burned through the fastest. It covered that several miles in a very, very short period of time. It moved about 2 or 3 miles per hour, which is really fast for a forest fire. And people had, as a consequence, less time to evacuate. And 86 people lost their lives, and over 14,000 homes were burned. Look, there's no guarantees when it comes to wildfire. There's no 100%. But what we do know is if we focus our resources on home hardening, on defensible space pruning, and on evacuation assistance, and community fire-safe shelters, it saves homes and it saves lives. It's highly effective. And while it's hard to get to 100%, we do have numerous real-life examples of 99% plus effectiveness in terms of homes and everyone getting out safely. But there's a lot of misinformation out there. We have a lot of people who understandably are doing things a certain way, and it's working for them, right? It's working for them economically, it's working for them politically. I understand all that, but I also understand I think we need to change. There was a trio of articles from a number of Forest Service authors in 2021. They got published in the journal Ecological Applications. And basically the message was, the science is settled. Don't bother us with notions that the forests, used to be denser in some areas than we thought. Don't bother us with notions that thinning is not effective. The science is settled. We're moving ahead with our game plan. A number of problems with that. The first problem is, even those articles admitted that that's not really true. So over and over and over again, they had to admit, because these articles go through the scientific peer review process, which sometimes doesn't work that well and sometimes works okay. But they had to make concessions. They said, well, thinning can cause higher surface fuel loads. Thinning, quote, can contribute to high-intensity surface fires and elevated levels of associated tree mortality and elevated fire intensities. Thinning, quote, can lead to increased surface wind speed and fuel heating, which allows for increased rates of fire spread in thin forests. And thinning, quote, may increase the risk of fire by increasing sunlight exposure to the forest floor, drying vegetation, promoting understory growth, and increasing wind speeds. A lot of the things we just talked about. And there's numerous other emissions in this. So, and then they went right back to their narrative, let's do more thinning. And so, I'm a scientist, I follow the evidence, and you know, to me, the evidence is speaking loudly. They cited a number of scientific studies. They said, yeah, but even with these concessions and these, you know, these caveats, we still think that, on balance, the science says thinning's a good idea, let's do more thinning. And they cited a number of studies. So these are three of the key studies they cited. Now, of course, what I do is I look up those studies, and I look at the results, I look at the figures, I look at the graphs, I see what they say. And they didn't really say that. In fact, they said the opposite. So the first one showed the thin forests, and I looked at the figure, and it's actually those thin areas burn mostly high intensity. They didn't burn mostly low intensity. And the only thing the study could say is that some of the thin forests burned at low intensity. Well, of course, that's always true. You know, wind and temperatures are variable. The second one had a figure that showed that the areas with wildfire alone had the lowest fire intensity, lower than the thin forest. So why are we doing thinning if fire alone is resulting in lower fire intensity? It didn't add up. Another one showed that the thin forest had the fewest number of live trees, similar to what I found in the antelope fire paper. So even the studies they're citing to say, well, okay, we know that there's a number of studies out there that say that thinning is killing more trees, thinning is increasing fire intensity, we have to admit that, but we still think we have some good studies to hang our hat on to say let's do more of this, even though studies are not really saying that. And my colleagues and I did an exhaustive analysis of the main one of these three papers, which is called Hagman et al. 2021. And what the paper said was, look, there's these studies by these independent scientists, including this troublemaker named Chad Hanson and a couple of his buddies, Bill Baker, Dominic Dosala, and some others. And they published this, but look, we published all these studies that critique their papers. And so they had these series of tables, and they had our studies in the first column and then their studies in the next column. And the narrative they conveyed was, the science is settled. Yes, there have been some critics, and they published some papers, but we have rebutted those critics in our response articles. What they didn't tell their readers is that they omitted any mention of the fact that in every single case, we had published reply articles to their responses. And what we noted in those replies is that the response articles didn't even challenge our central findings. Instead, they critiqued some tangential points around the edges, and even those tangential points were mostly wrong. And so each of those response articles have been completely and thoroughly refuted and discredited by our reply articles, none of which were mentioned. We concluded in our paper we just published about a month ago that our rebuttal shows that evidence omitted in the review left a falsification of the scientific record with significant land management implications. So this matters because, again, the narrative they're presenting means more money to backcountry thinning, less money to home harming and defensible space, the things that we know keep people safe. So I'm going to cover just a couple more issues here that before we go to Q&A, but this is important because this is another one that comes up a lot. Well, what if you have these areas that have more dead trees? You know, dead trees, they must be really, really the thing that drives these fires. If you have more dead trees, that's got to be why fires are burning more intensely. And interestingly, once again, the evidence is really contradicting that. And it's, you know, studies I've published, but also Forest Service studies by other independent scientists. We are typically finding that either there's no relationship between the density of dead trees and fire intensity, or, as this study found, areas with more dead trees tend to burn less intensely. You know, I looked at this at the Creek Fire too. I looked at snag density, snags being standing dead trees, you know, that died in the drought several years earlier. And a lot of these had already fallen over and became down logs. So there was a lot of dead wood in these areas. And I looked at this, and there was no relationship. I didn't find that they burned less intensely, I just found no relationship at all between the density of dead trees and fire intensity. There just wasn't a relationship. Now, how could that be? Because you would think that they would really drive flames, right? Like down logs, they gotta be fuel. Well, yeah, they can burn, but mostly they only get partially consumed. If they're really well decayed, you know, and they're very old, they can get entirely consumed. But mostly that's from smoldering combustion long after the flames pass. But what people oftentimes don't think about is these other things, because forests are complex, fire is complex. And down logs, yeah, on one hand they can burn, but on the other hand they're like giant sponges. So a down log can soak up and store 25 times more water per cubic foot than the surrounding soil.
Wow.
They're massive repositories of water and moisture. And that affects fire. So fires and forests are so much more asymmetrical than we think. And you know, I have to talk about this one a little bit because, you know, especially since we're talking about, you know, thinning as a kind of fuel reduction strategy. My colleagues and I spent 4.5 years of intensive field research, collecting data in the largest study ever conducted on this particular question. 2 of the biggest fires that have happened in you know, the past decade or so, the Rim Fire and the Creek Fire in the Sierra Nevada. And we want to know, in these big, intense fires, what percentage of the tree biomass is actually consumed? Because a number of studies from U.S. Forest Service scientists use hypothetical modeling to draw conclusions, and without any field data at all. And it's what I call blue sky modeling. And they say, well, we're going to assume that 50% of the tree biomass is consumed in a fire. Now, if that was true, if a fire burns in the forest, you wouldn't really see trees, live or dead. You would just see these kind of 15-foot high stubs where the tree used to be, if that was really true. What we found is that less than 2% of the tree biomass is consumed, even in these really big, intense fires. It's actually 1.2% is what we found, conservatively less than 2%. And the biggest size material we found that really did get consumed was 2 centimeters in diameter, and that was rare. So whether the tree survives or whether it gets killed in the fire, the carbon is still there. So this matters because what it means is when they're doing these commercial thinning operations, and they're removing not just seedlings and saplings, but a lot of the mature trees as well, literally 98+% of what they're removing under the rubric of fuel reduction is literally non-combustible in a forest fire. It physically cannot burn. And in fact, thinning, in large part because of that, emits 3 times more carbon per acre than wildfire alone. Because most of the carbon in a tree that's removed from the forest ends up in the atmosphere almost immediately. Very little of it ends up in the lumber product. Branches, treetops, bark, the round parts, the mill residue, that all gets burned, usually for energy or in the field, and it goes into the atmosphere. And so what we find is at the end of the day, only a relatively small portion of carbon in a tree ends up in a lumber product that might stay in the house for several decades before it ends up in a landfill or something, but most of the carbon goes into the atmosphere almost immediately. Otherwise, it would stay in the forest. So this has serious climate change implications too. All right, so last, before we go to Q&A, I just want to talk a little bit about whether or not high-intensity fire destroys forests, because we hear this all the time, you know, catastrophic wildfire, mega fire, the idea that the fires are burning so hot that they sterilize the soil and nothing will grow afterwards. I've been doing this work in the field. I'm primarily, first and foremost, I'm a field ecologist. I'm a boots-on-the-ground guy. I've been doing 20 years of field work in these fires. I focus on high-intensity fire patches, especially the big ones. I have yet to find a single acre where that's true, except in some of the areas that have been post-fire logged that really have been converted to just kind of bare ground in some spots. But we'll talk about that for a little bit. But the first thing to keep in mind is that even the biggest fires are mostly low and moderate intensity. There are a lot of things that cause us to think that it's mostly high intensity, the giant walls of flames we see on the nightly news during fire season. And also just the color red, I mean, just the color scheme. Now I ask people, in fact I'm going to ask you, what percentage of the fire would you say that red comprises? Red is high intensity here. Yes? So, you know, oftentimes red kind of jumps out at you and it looks like it's quite a lot. It's not nothing, but that's 19.9% of the fire. Right, and you know, it looks like it might be more than that, but you know, it's over 80% low and moderate intensity, which is the green and yellow. Now, historically, before fire suppression, these forests are all mixed intensity, mixed conifer, ponderosa pine. These are mixed severity forest fire regimes. They had about 20 to 35% high intensity fire. So yeah, mostly low and moderate, but a significant component of high intensity. And that matters, and we know this from lots of different studies that have reconstructed this, different methodologies, ecological studies from charcoal studies, historical records from the early General Land Office or the early U.S. Geological Survey, early U.S. Forest Service surveys, lots of different methods, and they all come to this conclusion. It was a pretty significant component. And what we found is when we went to these historical records, that a series of Forest Service studies had omitted most of the evidence, including all the data on small trees. And so it gave a skewed impression of historical forest density. It gave the impression that forests were very open and park-like with low tree densities. I asked them to share their data. They refused, and that piqued my curiosity. So I went to the National Archives and I spent month after month after month looking at these century-old original records under these very controlled conditions. And you've got to be in this room with all windows, and you've got to, you know, do all these special things, and you can't, you know, bring a pen with you, and you know, you're monitored the whole time because they're really important historical records, and you've got to treat it with care. And I spent my colleagues and I, long hours and days and months with these original records. And what we found was that the Forest Service folks had omitted over 90% of the plot data, and most of those areas showed denser forests historically, and they omitted all the small tree data. When we included all of the data that was available from these early forest surveys, instead of selecting the subset of it, when we included all the small tree data, we found that historical forests were 7 times denser than the Forest Service reported in terms of trees per acre in mixed conifer forests historically, before fire suppression in unlogged forests, and it was 17 times denser in ponderosa pine forests. That finding is undisputed, it's uncontested in the scientific literature. It's also interesting that when we found all the evidence on historical high severity fire that was significant. There were large patches, there were small patches, and this just shows mapping done by the U.S. Geological Survey in the 1880s and 1890s in northern Sierra Nevada. Those crosshatch areas are high severity fire patches. And you can see from the scale here, these are big. Some of these are 10, 15,000, 20,000 acres in size. And that's over the course of an entire century. So they don't happen all the time, but they do happen. So what does it mean when you have a high intensity fire patch? When you have a portion of a fire that burns hot and kills most or all the trees? Is that destroyed? Or is it something else? What we find is, and now in this one, there's literally hundreds of studies backing this up. And I talk about a lot of them. I have them cited in my book Smokescreen and also in the Nature's Phoenix book. But bottom line is that many different wildlife species have evolved to depend on this habitat type, what we call snag forest habitat. They depend on it for their survival. You won't find them in mature old forests, or if you find them there, it'll be very rare. You find them in these areas. They need dead trees. They need the native shrubs growing up. You know, a number of them need those for very specific reasons. You know, one I've been studying for over 2 decades is the black-backed woodpecker. The black-backed woodpecker needs large patches of high-intensity fire in dense mature forests. They need really high densities of medium and large snags, fire-killed across big areas. Why do they need that? Because native wood-boring beetles depend on recently fire-killed trees in order to reproduce. And the wood-boring beetles have evolved receptors in their bodies to detect fire by smoke or heat, and they will fly right toward a fire area. They'll land on the charred bark of a fire-killed tree not long after the flames have passed and after the smoke is cleared. And they will lay their eggs, and the larvae develop and bore through the charred bark into the wood of the tree, and over time they develop into an adult. And then they emerge, fly away, and go through another cycle, either that fire or another fire. But while they're in the tree as larvae, that's the primary food source for the black-backed woodpecker. And they have all these evolutionary adaptations that allow them to strike really hard, deep through the wood, and get those big grubs and pull them out. Dead trees are also softer than black trees, and so it allows them to excavate the nest cavities. Blackbacks excavate 2 or 3 nest cavities every single year, one pair. They're monogamous. And the male will do a lot of work, the female will help, the female will pick the one she likes the best every year, and all the nest cavities that they create but don't pick every year are available to all the other cavity nesting species in the forest that have to have tree cavities to raise their young, but cannot create them on their own. Bluebirds, nuthatches, flying squirrels, chipmunks, dozens and dozens of bird and small mammal species have to have those cavities. Can't have them without the woodpeckers to create them, can't have the woodpeckers without the dead trees, and without the beetle larva that depends on the dead trees, and without the fire that kills the trees. And then you have this other community that is associated with all the native shrubs that only are stimulated to growth by high-intensity fire. Wood warblers, small mammals, and fly-catching birds that eat the many insect species that are attracted to the flowering plants that grow in the understory. And for these reasons, total bird abundance is actually highest in these high-intensity fire patches. So it turns out that the research is telling us snag forest habitat is actually comparable to old-growth forest in terms of native biodiversity and wildlife abundance. Again, seemingly counterintuitive, but that's what the science is telling us. These areas are ecological treasures, they're not destroyed. Now, what about regeneration? Do the forests regenerate, or are they really these barren wastelands? And this is me and a different Dr. Hanson. This is Dr. James Hanson, famed climate scientist. He and I were doing some work together in the Rim Fire. And this is an area, among many areas in the Rim Fire, that the Forest Service said would not regenerate because the high-intensity fire patch was too big and there was no seed source nearby. But what we found is that the forest was vigorously regenerating, even more than 1,000 feet from the nearest live surviving tree. Right next door, same high-intensity fire patch. This area had been post-fire logged and artificially planted 5 years before we took this picture, based on the argument that the forest needed this to happen in order to get tree cover back. Most of what they planted died because they had done so much damage. They removed the nutrients by removing the trees, they removed the shade, and they compacted and damaged the soil with the logging machine. And the seedlings they planted were grown in nurseries. They weren't adapted to that local site, and they baked in the sun, and most of them died. And they sprayed more herbicides and planted again, and most of them died. And that's what it still looks like. Now, there are places where they plant and, some die, but some survive. That's true too. But this is a very common thing in these post-fire log areas. This is another example of the Rim Fire. This is over 300 meters from the nearest live surviving tree. This is one of the interior, one of the biggest high-intensity fire patches in the Rim Fire. This is 8 years post-fire, and these trees are over 12 feet tall. And you have about 300 or 400 per acre. This is all natural regeneration. Right next door, same high-intensity fire patch, a stone's throw away, literally. This area had been post-fire logged and artificially planted. And what you see here is stumps and a lot of very combustible invasive grasses, mostly cheatgrass. And so, this is what's happening under the guise of fuel reduction and reforestation. And so people need to know that this is not a great way to spend our money. Now, we've heard a lot about giant sequoias. The fires are killing all the giant sequoias. And I'm doing some work on this right now, and just to, not give away too much, bottom line is that the reports of giant sequoia mortality of mature sequoias have been dramatically exaggerated. Fire will always kill a certain percentage of mature sequoias. It needs to. Because mature sequoias as a species, are serratus. They need fire to reproduce. And not just any fire, they need moderate and high intensity fire in order to melt the resins, release the seeds in order to consume that thick duff and litter on the forest floor and turn it into a nutrient-rich bed of mineral ash in order to create more sunlight for the seedlings to grow. You need that intense fire. They're adapted to it. But fire of that intensity is always going to kill some percentage of the mature sequoias. But here's what I'm finding. This is hundreds of giant sequoia seedlings and saplings per acre in a high-intensity fire patch. In an area of a grove that had been slowly dying off due to lack of fire for more than a century, without any fanfare. Another one almost every year, another one gone every decade, more dying. Some die from age, some get blown over by the wind. Trees die, even the really big old ones. And they weren't being replaced because giant sequoias have almost no potential to reproduce in unburned forests or in low-intensity fire areas. This is more in a high-intensity fire patch, growing up right through 100% shrub cover, doesn't matter. And this is what happens. This is what it looks like in the low-intensity fire areas. This is the same grove, and it's essentially zero. So that's their life cycle. But even in the largest high-intensity fire patches, what we're finding is that there's abundant regeneration. You just have to have field plots that are big enough. Because what's happening is that some researchers are putting in these tiny little field plots, and then they're coming up with a bunch of zeros. Well, if your field plots are tiny, of course you're going to come up with a bunch of zeros in terms of your seedlings. You could go into an old-growth forest, and if your field plots are too small, you're going to have a bunch of zeros. And then you say, oh my gosh, look, X% of the forest has been deforested. And it's actually just illusory. It's not really happening. So we're finding that consistently these areas are regenerating. And even in the interior of these large high-intensity fire patches. So I'm going to leave it there and open it up to questions. But I will say one thing before we do that. There was a study that came out recently that said that 30% of the Sierra Nevada forests had been converted to non-forest by recent fires. And without any field data or any even validation from satellite imagery. And we've looked at that, and it's not even remotely true. Most of those areas are mature closed canopy forest. All you have to do is just do some ground truthing or look at it on the satellite imagery. This is just one example of that. And the areas that really did burn high intensity are all regenerating just fine. So I will leave it there, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
You used the term intensity and severity a lot. Could you define exactly what that means and how is it measured?
So, in a technical sense, intensity is the energy release. And it can be measured in a number of different ways. Sometimes by flame height, that's common. But in a technical sense, it's the energy release. Severity is a measure of the percentage of the above-ground vegetation that is killed by a fire. You can actually measure soil severity too, and that has a different way to measure it. But in terms of vegetation severity, the general definition is low severity is 0 to 25% mortality, moderate is 25 to 75%, and high severity is 75 to 100%. I typically use the term intensity. Sometimes I slip into the term severity. When I'm talking, when I'm giving presentations and I'm talking to the general public, I use the term intensity because it's value neutral. When I publish scientific studies, I have to use the word severity because it's just so ingrained, and it just becomes a problem in the peer review process if you try to change the terminology. But the reason I don't use the term severity very often is because it has a pejorative connotation. And in my Smokescreen book, I have a good chapter devoted to language and the consequences of the pejorative terminology and the way it drives bad policies. Catastrophic wildfire, for example. Moonscape fires have destroyed a certain number of acres instead of just burned a certain number of acres or affected a certain number of acres. Words have consequences, and so I avoid the word severity for that reason, even though it's kind of subtle. Yeah.
I've noticed that right now we're going through this situation where all of the branches of the trees, especially near the freeway, but even in the forests, are being taken off all, up 10 or 12 feet or more, whatever. And it would seem to me that, it almost seems like they're turning the forest into a plantation instead of a forest, because to me, what you were indicating earlier is that the animals need the underbrush, and, the diversity of the forest isn't just the trees, it's all of the flora and fauna and everything, even the bugs and the insects.
Right.
And what I'm wondering, it seems to me that when they take all the branches off, that would increase greater airflow and greater intensity. Why is that being allowed?
Yeah.
The other thing is the drying out of the soil seems like it would kill more trees.
Yeah.
Because more sunlight reaches the ground, and even if they're putting some of the, the trees back as mulch, that doesn't seem like it's going to keep the soil from drying out sufficiently.
Right. Well, so for folks who couldn't hear in the back, the question was, basically, why are they removing the branches on the trees? Doesn't that allow the winds to sweep through faster and also reduce some of the complexity in the forest, and also in terms of the soil effects?
Yeah.
Right. You can have a drying effect on the soils, and I agree. There are places where it matters and it makes sense to remove branches on the tree next to your home.
Yeah.
Right? So next to your home, if you've got a tree that's close and it's got a branch that's extending toward the wall of the house that's not far away, even I will remove that branch, right? Because it can carry the flames to a deck or to the roof. And so there's a reason for that. But out in the forest, no, it's not helpful. It's not going to stop the fire. And it can cause the winds to sweep through faster because branches, including those lower branches, act as a windbreak, just like the rest of the tree does. And it definitely can cause soil drying, and that can affect fire as well. But to get to your deeper question, which I think is really important, about the kind of complexity of the forest, I just want to speak to that a little bit because there's this, the way that the current management paradigm is treating forests is basically simplifying that. So in the typical thinning project, almost all of the understory is gone. And you still have trees, they're widely spaced, but the small trees are gone. Most of the snags are gone. The down logs are mostly gone. The shrubs. And so you have this simplified system, and you refer to it as like they're almost creating like a tree plantation. Well, I think you're right. I think in a way it is creating a kind of homogenized, simplified system that is very much like a tree plantation. It's kind of a sterilized system in an ecological sense. A biodiverse forest, a forest that has a lot of wildlife abundance, doesn't look clean and neat. It's messy. It's complex. It's got things strewn around.
Yeah.
It's not orderly. And so, an orderly, cleaned up forest is the last thing we want.
Right.
From a biodiversity standpoint or from an environmental standpoint. Seth, and then
aren't invasives also encouraged by tree plantation?
Invasive species, invasive weeds, for example?
Yes.
Yeah. So, yes, absolutely. And this is one of the big issues. I didn't talk about this as much, but it is a big issue. Is that
what was his question?
Sorry. For those who didn't hear, he asked if invasive weeds are kind of encouraged by tree plantations and by various logging operations. And the answer is yeah, for a couple of reasons. Number one is that these invasive grasses, have tiny little seeds, and they're basically in the treads of the logging machinery. You can't get it out, and sometimes they'll say, well, we hose it off, and it doesn't work. Anytime you have ground-based logging machinery, it's going to introduce those seeds into an area. It's going to spread those invasive grasses. The big one is cheatgrass. It's highly combustible, and it's invasive, non-native grass. And when logging happens, whether it's a clear cut or a commercial thin, it allows those grasses to proliferate because you have more sunlight and less canopy cover, and they like a lot of sunlight, so they spread like weeds, and they can carry flames really, really readily. And then, Bruce,
yeah, you mentioned how the Forest Service and different government agencies and sort of the scientific, maybe majority consensus is around this old system of thinning out the forest and clear cutting, or reducing fuel reduction.
Right.
And is that just, do you think, just because of scientific and inertia about what they seem like common sense, or is there other issues like economic issues that might be coming to play as far as who's doing the funding of these things,
right,
and or who's funding the universities that might be supporting that? What is the mix there?
I mean, it's a really important question, and it's a complex question with a complex answer. I talk about this a lot in my book, Smokescreen, but short answer is this. Money is definitely a big factor. It's not the only factor, but it's a big one. As probably most or all of you know, one of the main things the U.S. Forest Service does is sell public timber to private logging companies and keep the revenue. They keep most of the revenue typically in a commercial thinning operation. They keep 100% of the revenue in a post-fire logging operation. So they have a strong financial incentive, but it's not just that. It's not just the timber sale receipts that they keep for their budget. It's also the appropriations coming from Congress, because Congress is sending them billions of dollars and saying, hey, we want you to do these logging operations, call it restoration, call it fuel reduction. And the ranger districts or the forests that do the biggest projects tend to get more money. They're seen as performers, and the Washington office will allocate more money. And so they get money both directions. So they have a strong financial incentive. There's no question about that. Some of it's basically what people learn in forestry schools. They kind of learn to see forests as board feet, not as ecosystems. And these outdated notions about dense forests are overgrown and they're going to burn more intensely are really kind of drilled into people's heads, even though there's so much evidence contradicting that. And so, there's a certain level of indoctrination that can happen, to people. And the reality is that, all of these agencies, they're not monolithic. At the individual level, there's all kinds of attitudes and dispositions. There's some great people in the Forest Service. There's some great people in CAL FIRE. And there are people who are paying attention to science. There are people who even disagree with the way things are being done right now. Might want them to be done differently. But if that's the dominant management paradigm right now, if you are the squeaky wheel, you don't get the grease, you get penalized. And there's lots of ways that can happen in the agency. So dissent is not openly encouraged. It's discouraged, and sometimes aggressively. And that can be a problem. That can be difficult for folks, I think.
Yeah, Dr. Hanson, first I'd like to say thank you for coming to our small community. I was on that annual fire. In fact, I managed some of the private properties around that management of that annual fire. Had about 8,500 acres that burned, some high intensity, some not high intensity. And like you said, there's mostly weather and climate driven. But there's also up there, there's difference between north-facing and south-facing slopes, and also between elevations. And when you talk about commercial thinning, there's all different types of commercial thinning. And on the grounds that we had, the commercial thinning we had an emphasis on fire resistance. We had less mortality in those type of thinnings than a natural forest and than the surrounding forest. If it was just more of a traditional commercial thinning, then depending on how long ago it occurred. So, I mean, that's anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
But I'd like to, if possible, I'd like to get the citation for your paper, because I read your paper on the antelope fire. And the other thing I was wondering if you could go back to your very first slide, as I have a question on, it seemed like at the very beginning of the slide, you had almost zero or no vegetation and the highest intensity. So how can that occur? Right there.
This one here.
You have the highest intensity is almost where you have zero biomass. How did you get that?
Yeah, so I'll answer your second question first, and then I want to go back to the antelope fire. In an area like that, you're talking about a young tree plantation, generally speaking. I mean, that's pretty much what most of those areas were like, young tree plantations, very, very low biomass, kind of densely packed small trees, and they burn oftentimes pretty hot. Not always, but oftentimes. Whereas on the upper end of the scale, you're talking about, you know, denser, mature, closed canopy forests. And again, it's not like they can't burn at high intensity, but on average, they tend to burn, on average, at lower intensity. In terms of the antelope fire paper, I'd be happy to send you a PDF, but it's open access. You can just go into Google Scholar and just Google Hanson Antelope Fire 2021. You should pull it up, no problem. You can download a PDF for free. And you can read through my methodology. And my email address is on the first page of the study. Feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to answer questions. Also, you know, give me a call if you want. But just to answer your question now.
Real quick, the year was 2022 or 2023?
2021. Yeah, Hanson 2021. Just Google Hanson 2021 Antelope Fire, and you should pull up a free PDF, no problem. So here's what I did in that paper. There were thinning units that had been thinned, varying in intensity. Some were very light touch, some were pretty intensive. So you're absolutely right, it was very variable. But all of those data were available unit by unit in previous publications, which was great because I was able to actually compare that in each unit. And so I knew the level of basal area reduction in each unit. And some it was like 9%, and some it was much, much higher, right? From thinning. And then of course, then we had the fire severity map, which is associated with basal area mortality there. So I was able just to add those two together. But what I did is in each thinning unit, I compared, so for example, like let's say this is, you know, a thinning unit, they were pretty much kind of square, most of them. I compared inside the thinning unit at a standardized distance, and then outside the unthinned at the same distance. So as even a comparison as I could possibly do. Now obviously you can't guarantee it's going to be exactly the same slope, but at that distance, and always with the comparison, burned on the same day, right? So as best as I could do in the same conditions, because they were only, I think, 300 meters apart, inside and outside. So I controlled for, oh, and I'm sorry, the other thing, of course, is with a decent sample size, you're going to control for some of that variability, right? You know, as you know, you can't get it exactly the same in each one, but that's why you have a decent sample size. If your sample size is too small, you get all kinds of noise, and you might come to erroneous conclusions. But, you know, I had a large sample size statistically, and so, you know, it should handle that, especially controlling for comparison plot locations at a very short distance inside the thinning unit and outside. So I did the best I could to control for those factors. And you know, if you're looking at really subtle differences, then I think, you know, you can raise questions and say, you know, maybe it's not a real result. But you know, the difference was very statistically significant. It was a pretty big difference. 59% tree mortality. And again, this is cumulative severity, right? So this is mortality from thinning plus mortality from fire. 59% basal area mortality in the thin units, 39% in the unthinned. So, you know, and this, of course, was statistically significant. The point is that, and by the way, and you'll see this when you read the paper, and again, like I said, I'm happy to talk about the paper. I love talking about this stuff. I'll talk all day long. So, you know, please do reach out. But interestingly, if you didn't look at the mortality from thinning itself, you would actually draw the conclusion that thinning was slightly effective. In this particular fire, the tree mortality from from the fire itself was slightly lower in the thin units than it was in the unthinned. Now, it was such a small difference that it's not a statistically significant difference, but the point is just numerically, I think it was like 4% lower or something like that. So you could say, good, look, thinning works. It was lower severity in the thin units. But when you account for the tree mortality from thinning itself, it was much higher overall, mortality. And this is why we studied the exact same question again, slightly different methodology, but same question in a bigger data set in the Caldor fire to see if it was just a fluke or if we would find the same thing. We found the same thing. Yeah?
Are you familiar with the research that was done on cone fire in Madison County on Black's Mountain State Experimental Forest?
Yeah, I am. Well, I mean, I assume it's the same paper. It's kind of an older paper, but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
So that was very interesting. Research and conclusions that they came up with regarding thinning and how to make thinning work.
Well, so for folks who didn't hear the question was about some research that had been done some years ago about the cone fire on Black's Mountain Experimental Forest. And the conclusion, I'm missing it. I'll ask you your question next. Sorry for missing it. And the question was, what are my thoughts on that study? Because the conclusion of the study was, thinning is effective at reducing fire severity. Long story short.
Under certain conditions?
Yes, under certain conditions. So here's what I think is happening here. There's two things. Number one, they didn't take into account the tree mortality from thinning. So the cumulative severity thing hadn't been taken into account. To me, that's really key because it turns out it's a pretty big factor. But I think there's another thing happening there, and I haven't talked about this yet, but I'm glad you asked the question because there's a narrative out there that prescribed fire can modify fire behavior. Check, yes, it can for a certain period of time. So can previous wildfire, it'll modify fire behavior for a certain period of time. And so, or the combination of thinning plus prescribed fire. And it's funny because oftentimes people just say, well, thinning plus prescribed fire or just prescribed fire, but those are very different things. So it's kind of like, I could do a study and say, where you could go out there and do thinning and then say, it's thinning plus, hop on your left foot in a circle, and does that reduce fire severity? Well, prescribed fire plus hopping in a circle. The question is, which variable is relevant, which variable is just a third variable that may not be that relevant, or may actually cut the other way. We know that prescribed fire can modify fire behavior because there's lots of studies about just prescribed fire with no prior tree removal or just previous wildfire. And the research on that is really consistent. And so the question is, do you need to do thinning prior to prescribed fire to get that result? Or is that really kind of a third variable? Or is it even something that's actually cutting the other way a little bit? What I think is happening, we can talk about it more if you want, and feel free to reach out, we can go into the details of that study, but what I think is happening in that study and some others is that the areas where it really did seem to burn at lower intensity in the thinned ones versus the unthinned had nothing to do with thinning. It had everything to do with the fact that prescribed fire had been applied in a relatively short period of time before the wildfire occurred. And I think that's the real factor. And so if you look at the research on prescribed fire alone or just previous managed wildfire, but fire alone with no thinning versus thinning plus fire, what you see is that you actually tend to get the greater reductions in fire severity from fire alone with no tree removal than you do with thinning plus fire. And that's without even accounting for the tree mortality from thinning. So, from my standpoint, that's what's happening because, if you have prescribed fire that happened, 2, 3, or whatever years, a relatively short period of time before the wildfire, you don't have much small twigs and pine needles and on the forest floor and that kind of understory, more combustible understory vegetation. I think that's what's happening there, at least that's my working theory. But, it's not like thin forests always burn at high intensity. They don't. They burn mostly at low and moderate, just like unthin forests do. And so it's about the averages, right? You can always find thin forests that burn at low intensity. That's true in almost every big fire. Go ahead. In the back? Yeah.
Well, I guess just about everybody here knows me because I'm one of the local retired Forest Service guys. And this is a marvelously good presentation. I've been doing forestry since 1966.
Thank you.
Graduated from International School of Forestry in Missoula in 1971, 5-year program. Went and did wildland ecology and got a master's in zoology about 1976. And like I said, been doing forestry seasonal, 66, right up through the ranks. Got my 35 years in. And I did do a grade, certainly a grade A on this, so maybe even an A+. even a ton of people are saying that entomologists, yes, I did entomology and mycology right here locally, and a lot of it in another ranger district except that. And like 99%, you are correct, sir, but I'd sure like to know what to do about the local idiot centers.
Well, first of all, thank you, and I love your description of your background and all the different aspects of this issue that you touched on. This is really cool.
Yeah, I've been there, done that.
Yeah, no,
exactly what you're saying.
I get it.
This happens all the time.
Yeah.
You finish the burns like hell.
I know. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. And so to your question, like, how do you get through to people, right? You know.
How do you get through to them?
So
they don't want to hear it.
Here's my answer. Like I said, I'm a scientist. I follow the evidence and I talk about the evidence. For me, I decided a long time ago, it's not enough to just do my research and publish it in the peer-reviewed journals and let it get stuck in a drawer and maybe some people read it. That's not enough. You know, science, in my view, has to matter, right? So I spent half of my time doing the research and the other half of the time communicating it to the public. So, and you know, all comers, right? I mean, I talk to foresters, I talk to general public, I talk to environmental groups, I talk to politicians, I talk to everybody. And, you know, sometimes they're not too friendly about it, sometimes they're receptive, sometimes they just don't get it. But my answer to your question is, first of all, you got to engage, right? You got to communicate the science. You got to translate it for people.
Keep trying.
Absolutely, amen. But the other thing is, for me, dogged, boneheaded persistence.
Pardon?
Dogged, boneheaded persistence.
If anybody wants to see it still going on, just go up here to Everett Memorial Highway, about 3 miles away, and look what Carolyn Napper did up in that area.
Yeah.
Thinned it all wrong.
Yeah.
To make a fuel break.
Yeah, right. And the thing is that, I mean, you all know, right? I mean, we live in mountain communities. You know, I've lived in mountain communities in fire country most of my adult life, and for a lot of, you know, my life before that. And we've seen the big fires, and we see where they, you know, what they burn through, and we see, you know, that on those hot, dry, windy days, nothing's stopping that fire, right?
I think it burned faster through the fuel breaks than it burned through the regular timber.
Exactly, and there's a lot.
I've seen that for 50 years.
And you're seeing it in real time. You're seeing it in person, and there's a lot of science backing up exactly what you're seeing. That the fires are actually oftentimes moving faster through those thin areas, I think it's just a matter of communicating, not just the fact there's a lot of science, but also real-world examples, right? I mean, we saw it in the Camp Fire, we saw it in the Dixie Fire, we saw it in the Caldor Fire, we saw it, you know, over and over and over. We saw it in the Creek Fire. We've seen it again and again and again and again. That this is not the way to keep people safe. It doesn't work. And I think that's really kind of just the reckoning that we need to have with, you know, with politicians, with communities, with agencies. We just need to have that reckoning and just, honestly, just get away from the data for a moment and just say, listen, can we just have a candid conversation? What did this fire do? Because, I mean, some of the areas that these fires are making the biggest runs through, and you know this, I'm not telling you something you don't already know, you know? You know this as well as I do. Some of the areas that these fires are making the biggest, fastest runs are the areas where these massive areas have been thinned, oftentimes for years. I mean, look at what the Dixie Fire did on that run up to the west side of Chester. That was the biggest run, and those forests have mostly been heavily thinned for decades, right? So, you know, this, you know, sure, folks want to, you know, they're in the business and they want to make money, and this is their way of doing it. Then, you know, they can make that argument, and we can have that policy and economic discussion about that and how we want to weigh that as a society in terms of balancing it with community safety, with biodiversity, with climate change. We can have that conversation, but at least it's a candid conversation. Right now, we're not having a candid conversation. I mean, we are here, but we're not, as a society, we're not having a candid conversation.
It's the monkey.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I think you bring a lot of ideas to this discussion and a lot of information, but in some ways you're kind of oversimplifying things, and at the same time you're telling us how complex this is. The thinnings are one tool. The prescribed fires are another tool. We have lots of forests that we can't manage, that they just don't lend themselves to it, or they're too rugged, or they're wilderness areas, or other types of designations. So I think I'm a little confused sometimes with what you're saying here, because at one point you're saying that a large fire that normally would have high severity in the 20 to 30% range and creates all these openings and open forest conditions, but those are all now open forests, just like a thinning. And so they're going to burn and allow sunlight in, which is a lot of biodiversity. It creates that understory development.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not like we can sit here and say the whole forest should be fireproof. Or,
yeah.
And there's a lot of good people working on this, including yourself.
No, I appreciate that.
A little bit, I think back that you have to imply that there's a lot of dishonest people working on this, but in fact, everybody in this community that lives here and works in the forest, we are the ones that are dealing with the consequences of these fires.
Well, let me try to answer your question. So first of all, when I talk about some misinformation, I'm talking about some very specific studies that were not forthright, right? So I'm not making statements like that about people in this community. I'm talking about specific scientific studies that weren't particularly honest. But I think you raise a really important question, okay? And you know, I do the best I can to take a very complex issue and try to discuss it in an hour or so. And I have a lot more nuance in my book, and I'm happy to talk on the phone anytime. But in answer to your question, which you know, to me, the core of it that I think I really want to respond to is that the idea about thinning versus fire and the differences. Because, you know, sure, fire can have all kinds of subsequent effects on the next fire. Typically, it's going to reduce fire intensity for a certain period of time. Over a period of time, you know, a certain area might burn a little more intensity if it has really high shrub cover, for example. You know, as the forest grows, the new regenerating forest grows up, those shrubs will die back, and you might get less intensity. So it depends on how long it is and the time after the fire and how it burned before. It's not a bad thing if an area burns at high intensity. It's not a bad thing if it burns at low intensity. The point I'm making is it's not going to stop fires and it won't protect communities. And right now, the vast majority of our money and our resources and our focus and attention, politicians at the state level, the federal level, and agencies, is on these backcountry forest management projects, mostly thinning, some post-fire logging. And the narrative is that that's going to stop fire and protect homes. And it's not doing that. And so the point is, my point I'm making is that it's not accomplishing what they're saying it's going to accomplish. But the other point I want to make is that it does not mimic wildfire. Because the difference is that if you have a thin forest that's a little open, and you have versus a kind of moderate intensity fire area where the fire kills half the trees and it's kind of open, the area that burned has snags where the trees were killed instead of stumps. The stumps don't contribute to the ecosystem in any significant way. The snags contribute in a massive way. It's carbon storage, it's wildlife habitat. When they fall, they decay. It's nutrient cycling that helps the forest grow and maintain its productivity. So it's really not the same thing. Now again, there's economic and political arguments for removing trees from the forest, and we still use a lot of wood products in this country. We can do things differently, we can do things better. And the main thing I'm trying to get across is that when politicians are selling the public the notion that when they spend more billions of dollars of taxpayer money on backcountry logging projects and call it fuel reduction, and community safety, it's not going to deliver. It's actually going to put people at greater risk. And that's what concerns me a whole lot right now. I'm sorry, you have a question. You've been waiting patiently.
No, I also appreciate your presentation and just the science that you brought behind it. And I think also what I hear, because I live here in town, is that mindset, which you said, that if we do these fuel breaks, right, the town's going to be safe. And, you know, just recently happened on the south end of town, the landing, a massive fuel break around there to keep the town safe, to do their part of a fuel break. Rainbow Ridge slated for another huge fuel break where it basically hasn't been tended to for a long time. So now, instead of feeling safe about the fuel break, I'm going to go home and have a little anxiety and wonder really about, well, you know, everyone probably in this room lives surrounded by national forest on all sides. And so, you know, what do we as a community do? We're inhabiting this space where this is the paradigm of treatment. And, you know, now as a community, those sitting in this room who believe what you say, we're kind of feeling, ooh, we're like going to be sitting ducks. Sitting ducks.
It's a great question, and for those who didn't hear it, I'll try to boil it down. If the fuel breaks out in the wildlands are not effective, you know, what do we do, right?
Well, they're counterproductive.
They're actually, if they're counterproductive, what do we do? The point is that whether they do fuel breaks, so-called, out in the forest or not, the only thing that really protects homes from fire is home hardening, defensible space, and evacuation assistance, and good evacuation routes. Every community has, and every homeowner has some control over that. And not everyone has the resources, but you know, people can ask for help, apply for grants. There's a lot of money out there floating around that can be used for this. It's usually being used for the wrong thing, but it can be used for the right thing. And so the point is that it's kind of a less is more approach. It's not really about cutting mature trees. It's about seedlings, saplings, dry grasses right next to the home. The 30 feet next to, the closest 30 feet next to the home is the most important. And I think that Seth is going to be talking about this specifically, so he'll be talking more about it. But bottom line is that's what works, and it really is extremely effective. Again, it's not necessarily 100%, although there are examples, but we're seeing many examples where it's 99+% effective. So that's what people need to do, is focus on the community, on the homes themselves. It's about what happens in less than 100 feet around each home and about the home itself. Simple things like pine needles and dry leaves on the roof. Sweep those off the roof in fire season, because most homes that ignite in a fire ignite from embers blown by the winds far in advance of the flames. Most of the homes that burn, they're already on flames before the fire even gets to the town, because they ignite from the embers, because there's dried leaves on the roof or needles, or there's 6 inches of dry pine needles and leaves in a rain gutter, and the ember lands on the roof and rolls down to the rain gutter. So make sure to clean the rain gutters or have rain gutter guards so that doesn't accumulate. A key one, ember-proof vents. A lot of homes have these old coarse wire mesh vents on attic space. In many fires, over 50% of the homes that burn from embers driven by the winds going through an old coarse wire mesh vent. The modern ember-proof vents are very cost-effective. You know, I mean, they cost money, but I mean, you can maybe spend $100, $200 and save your home in many cases, you know, with ember-proof vents and a Phillips head screwdriver. So there are things that can be done that really do make a difference. And Seth's going to talk more about this, so I don't want to steal his thunder here. But the point is, there is hope. There is a game plan. There's a lot of science backing it up, a lot of real-world case studies. I talk about a lot of them in my book, Smokescreen. It really works. It works extraordinarily well, and that's the solution. The main problem with all the fuel breaks out in the wildlands is that, yeah, the fires, you know, will oftentimes move faster through them, but the main thing is it's just taking money away from the actual thing that will work. Because any dollar that's spent out in the wildlands doing a fuel break is a dollar that's not spent helping a homeowner do defensible space and home hardening. And we're not talking about chump change here, we're talking about billions of dollars. I mean, so it really does matter. So that's the main thing, honestly, that concerns me, is the diversion of resources and also the false sense of security I think it gives people. And so, but we know what works. We really do. We do know what works. We're not guessing about this. It really does work, and that's where we need to go. Yeah. So I'll wrap it up there. But thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to
Okay, so lots of the, Chad covered a lot of the stuff as far as the science goes. So we know intense fire is nothing new. We talked about the woodpecker and the expedition with John Muir done in the late 1890s. And lots of that data shows that intense fire is nothing new. We also have quite a lot of photographic evidence that shows that forests weren't necessarily just all open and park-like back then. They were also dense. They, as you can see, like this area in the Shasta County, super dense. Or this area behind this giant redwood, super dense. It's not they weren't necessarily very open. So, right now with the current policy and the effects of thinning dangerous trees in forest lands is what they like to use as the current answer. And one example of this is the Conco hazardous fuels reduction project that was used for the Conco area near Paradise, which we all know was swept through by a Camp Fire. And since it was driven by the climatic factors, it didn't really do what it was intended to do. So we know that it removes more carbon from the forest than it saves due to the cumulative mortality. It also decreases the forest's ability to regenerate, the compaction, the effects of logging. It's pretty harsh on the forest. It draws moisture from the soil. It also encourages growth of weeds. I was on the YCC. I can tell you, you can see exactly where they had driven machines down the rows in those exact spots. Like not even, like it would just be rows of musk thistle down there, and like maybe one or two on the sides, but exactly where they had driven machines, rows and rows of this invasive weed. And it also just damages animal habitat. So what policies should we advocate? So instead of allocating money to thinning, it'd be great if we start moving away from those things and focusing on more ecological solutions, like moving away from fossil fuels, retention of post-fire snag habitat, and especially improving community fire resilience, and just taking those funds and putting them more towards things like this. There's also like clean energy initiatives moving away from using biomass. It's just not as an effective way of producing clean energy. It releases a lot of carbon and also leaving remote wildfires alone. So you may be asking, so what can I do with all this information? So main ways would be, keep your home safe by improving its fire resilience, commenting on projects, and contacting your representatives. Water is a great example of this. We advocate thorough environmental review. So let's start with making your home more fire resilient. If you want to, you can refer to the handout. The first thing would be to remove flammables from the ignition zone. So especially within 5 feet of your home, just like, get rid of the pine needles in your gutters and, avoid like really flammable plants that may look nice, but, they're tinder box. Prune overhanging branches, avoid vulnerable mulch, then especially try to make your home out of consistent materials. Okay, and finally, one important thing, have a go-bag, have a plan. If fire comes, where am I going to go? How are we going to evacuate? Can I pack my truck really quick and get out of here? Are you ready? So, why is it more effective than thinning? As Chad mentioned, like those embers, they spread way ahead of the fire. So oftentimes, as you can see here, lots of those houses burned down before some trees did. And this is also like the same graphic that we saw in Chad's presentation. Like one example of this was the Grass Valley fire. Post-fire analysis showed that design was one of the major weaknesses and one of the reasons for high mortality for high construction of structures. So the next thing is, how do you comment on risk management projects? So National Forest along Paragon, it's public land. So most projects have a 30-day comment period after the draft environmental assessment is published. So to find out when these projects are in the works, a good way is to just get in contact with W.A.T.E.R, get on their email list, they'll tell you, and you can go in there and start looking at the projects. You can also look at the Schedule of Proposed Actions website. For anyone who wants that link, we can give it to you. And once you get there, you review the environmental assessment. And to make a comment, you just, once you know what project you want to review and you have looked at the assessment, you can write a letter. Personal testimonial is a great way to show why it's important to you. Tell them, for example, me. I rock climb. I love these places. It was important to me because this. I want to see this. I want to see these places protected. So that is one thing, and then also start referencing what you know, the scientific things you know. And you can do this. You can then send you can then send the letters to a physical address, or you can send it to an email to the specific email listed on the Schedule of Proposed Actions website. Okay, so as far as contacting your representatives, you can just go to their website. Our State Assembly, Megan Dahl, State Senator Brian Dahl, House Representative Doug LaMalpa, our Senators Alex Medea and Diane Einstein. You can just go to their websites. They usually have a contact representative drop down. You can use that to contact them. Okay, we're super excited, and thank you for listening. So if you're interested in keeping up with project proposals, you can just contact W.A.T.E.R, and I think we're going to get an email list for this, right?
Yeah, I don't know if we brought we could put up a sheet. I have a backside of this. We probably have a pen, and people could just put their email addresses, and we'll add you to our list if you're not on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's, I wish there had been more people out to hear this message, because I know our community really needs to know this. It's even Pacific Power knows that we're in a high fire danger zone here, even though they refuse to underground the power lines. Anyway, I guess if you want to hang around and talk. But we're going to break down now. So. I really want to thank Dr. Hanson. He's been very generous to come up to it and give us presentation. He was giving them away. I don't know if he has extras.
That was a great talk. Thank you. Appreciate it.